Now, and here's an offshoot of this. This is an existential offshoot. So here's a hypothesis. So you imagine, the existentialists continually claim, unlike the psychoanalysts, that people are psychopathological, not because, say, of childhood trauma, or neurosis, or repression, or failure to integrate elements of the id into the ego. The existentialists claim that the reason that people are psychopathological is because the conditions of existence are so tragic that it's inevitable that people become psychopathological. Right, and that's, okay, so what's the argument? Well, people are self-conscious, so that's a big problem. So, and because we're self-conscious, we know that we're going to die. We're aware of our temporal limitations. So that's a real catastrophe, because no other animal has that problem. Like elephants look like they've got some kind of a dim apprehension of it, but they're not articulate, so they can't really get to the final stage of, you know, assessing their existence in relationship to its finitude. And of course everyone knows that they're prone to illness of all sorts, and aging, and that, you know, so is everyone else they know, and that you can be damaged incomprehensibly by untruth and by falsehood and by betrayal, you know, and also that there's 150 things wrong with you that you're acutely aware of at almost all times. So you fall short of perfection along pretty much any axis of comparison that you wish to generate. And so the existential point of view on that is that all of that's enough to make the default condition of human beings psychopathological. It's like the weight of existence itself is sufficient to make normal pathological. And it's a very powerful argument, because one of the things you might ask, and it's certainly something I've asked when I've dealt with people who have agoraphobia, for example, who are afraid to go out. You know, they're afraid to go out because they might have a heart attack, and then they'll be too far away from the hospital, and then they'll die. Well, they make fools of themselves. That's basically the agoraphobic sphere. So it's biological mortality plus social exposure, right? It's bad enough to die, but if you die in public while everyone's looking at you, then, you know, you get the worst of both worlds. And it is, to me, it's not such a mystery that people are agoraphobic. It's a mystery that other people aren't. You know, and from the existential point of view, the mystery starts to become the ubiquity of normality, given the intolerable conditions of existence. It's a much more powerful viewpoint, and I think it's correct too, because there's no reason to assume that the default condition of mankind is like calm, rational acceptance of fate. It's like you have to have very, very specific conditions that you're in before you're calm and you know, feeling comfortable and sort of hopeful about the future. It's like, that's a rare state to achieve. We can assume that's normal, at least to some degree in our society, because it's unbelievably technologically sophisticated, and we're not hungry that often, we're not cold that often, or, you know, or even sick that often. But to think of that as the norm, it's like, no, definitely not. It's a miracle that it's ever like that. Now, the other claim the existentialists make, fundamentally, is something like this. Is like, well, if the fundamental conditions of existence are tragic, at minimum, because there's worse, there's evil too, which is different than tragedy. Because evil is sort of like unnecessary tragedy. You know, because there's earthquakes, say, and, you know, who are you going to blame about that? But then there's you going to school, and, you know, there's 4 people who've got it out for you, and all they do is pound you flat every time you enter the building, or make fun of you and, you know, try to torture you to death. That's not tragedy. It's not your accidental subjugation to fate. It's some horror show perpetrated on you by people whose only goal is to make sure that there's more suffering in the world rather than less. So you also have to put up with that. But we'll leave that aside for the time being. You're stuck in your pathology because the conditions of existence are intolerable to a self-conscious being. We'll say that. So then you might ask, well, what could you do about that? Well, here's one potential answer. And that answer is, see what happens if you stop doing things you know to be inadequate and wrong. So the hypothesis is every time you engage in an activity like that, you weaken yourself. You put yourself down first, you remove your own self-confidence, but you also fail to take the opportunity to expand your domain of competence. What would life be like if you didn't do that? And the existential claim is, it's a weak claim in some ways. The claim is, well, there's two. One is, if you don't do that, if you don't try to fix the things that you could fix, things will go from bad to worse for your life, and that will spread out, and it will take everyone else's life along with it. So that's on the negative end. So you don't do it because of the negative end. But then there's a positive claim too, which is maybe if you stopped bullying yourself, the tragic conditions of existence would become bearable because you would be strong enough to tolerate them. And it's analogous to Jung's idea of progression towards the self. Because Jung has a very strong existential theme underlying his work, derived mostly from Nietzsche. But it's the most optimistic, it's the only optimistic hypothesis I've ever seen in psychology. Truly optimistic hypothesis. Because there's other hypotheses like the positive illusion hypothesis, which is basically life is so tragic that you have to tell yourself, you know, happy falsehoods just so you don't go insane, and that's what normal people do, which I think is an absolutely appalling philosophy. It's the ultimate in cynicism, that. But still, there's a huge literature on the supposed utility of positive illusions. And then there's also the associated sort of terror management hypothesis, which is that the purpose of your belief systems is to protect you from the anxiety of death, which is sort of a variant of the Freudian idea that religion was a childish delusion designed to protect people from terror of their own mortality. It's a very powerful critique of religion, although it's one that I happen to think is wrong. I mean, one of the problems with Freud's formulation is that it fails to deal with, concepts like the underworld and hell. I mean, if you're going to just whip up a belief system to protect yourself against the fear of death, why in the world would you envision something like an eternity of suffering worse than death if you ever step out of line? It's very hard to understand how that's a defense mechanism. Now, a cynic would say, well, the only reason that, say, Christians invented hell, even though they didn't, it's a very old idea, is so that they had somewhere convenient to put people who didn't agree with them. But you have to be unbelievably cynical to assume that that's the only reason. And I don't think there's any historical support for the idea that that's the only reason.